Okay, let's begin with the word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so very thankful for the Sabbath and for the fellowship that we can have and the time that we have to study together. And we invite your Holy Spirit to be here as we open your word, as we try to understand thoroughly the prophecies, Revelation 12, 13, and 17, and particularly, Lord, the prophecy as it relates to our time. We pray that you can be with each person, that you can help us intellectually and spiritually to understand things, that you can help us in our personal life, that you can bring a conviction to us and the strength and power to obey your word. Be with each person now, be with us in our study. May you guide and direct us, is our prayer. In Jesus' name, amen. So, happy Sabbath, everyone. You can see on your screen a paper which I emailed out, and we're going to go through this. Now, I don't know how many people have ever read Bob Pickle's material, but he's a good, solid Adventist, very much based on um, uh, the understanding of the pioneers. And in this case, he's going to be presenting the view of the pioneers, that is, the views that Miller, Josiah Litch, Joseph Bates, and we also had read an article where Uriah Smith put forward this view as the view of the pioneers. So Bob Pickle does a good job at looking at the problem. And the reason why we're studying this, just for a review, is that we're trying to understand several different things. So we know that Collins put forth an idea regarding how we are to understand the presidents of the United States. So this main study of this series is on the presidents of the United States. And we also looked at a study of Odilio's, where he does a similar type of comparison with the emperors. And so we've looked at Odilio's study. And then last week we looked at Revelation chapter 12. And what we were really trying to understand is the differences between the beasts in Revelation 12, 13, and 17, and how we can make these applications that we've been making. So this is not a definitive study here. I'm not saying this is how we should understand things. What we're doing is we're examining the foundation of how Millerites understood things and trying to build up from there. So we're trying to see how God has unfolded light to Adventism and to this movement. Now, one of the things that we found as we were going through our whole series of understanding the foundations is that there's many things that we had misunderstandings regarding, or actually just false understandings of what the Millerites thought. And we found that there were things that they thought that were partially true, but because of the perspective that they had, they couldn't see beyond that. So just because the Millerites had a view doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, but it does mean that we should look at that view and understand why that view would need to be unfolded in our time. That is, the principles of Miller's methods, Miller's rules. We have to apply those to what were understood in the past. And if we have any new light, we know that all new light is an unfolding of established truths, and that it doesn't contradict the old light. It adds to it. So when we look at this study on Revelation 12, 13, and 17, one of the things we have noted is that the view, and this would be quite controversial in this movement because we've held this for a long time, but the view that the kingdoms are Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, Rome, Rome pagan and papal, then the United States, and then the United Nations is actually a really new view. It's not something that was understood by the pioneers at all. And yet we put a lot of weight on it. And the question is is there validity in that view? And if there is, how are we going to show that? How are we going to show that the Millerites were partially right, but there's things that they couldn't see? So we're not going to resolve all these things in this study today. We don't know how long it's going to take us to resolve everything. But we're hoping as we continue to go through these studies that we continue to learn and understand the problems, and also that we're corrected in places where we have error. So, this is, of course, a participation study. I look forward to people's observations. And we're going to read through Bob Pickle's paper. I've thought of, doing sort of a summary of it, but I didn't think that it's such a concise paper in some ways. There's some parts that we can skip, where he does some of this elimination of things that we're not even looking at. But it is a pretty concise paper. He brings things together so that we can look at them, and it's not a rhetorical type of paper. It's not a paper that's polemical in any way. He's not trying to he's not trying to make an argument and hide what he's doing. He's trying to be as open as he can. He's trying to look at the problem in a real way. Though there still would be biases like any person has. So and we can't talk to him personally. I mean, maybe I could have tried to track him down and invited him to this study, but the last time I've tried to do that, I found that the person had passed away, and I don't want to find that out with Bob Pickle. So we're just going to start reading here. Now, the question that he's asking is, who are these seven kings? So this is really Revelation 17. But what I'm really trying to focus on right now is actually the beasts of Revelation 13. We're going to address Revelation 17 in a lot more detail later on. So he says in Revelation 17, John sees a woman sitting upon a scarlet-colored beast. The beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. Who is the woman, and what are the heads? So the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. And here is a mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. The city that reigned over the kings of the earth for so long, and which sits on 7 hills, is unquestionably Rome. Somehow connected with this scene are 7 kings. There are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. Now, he's going to bring some points here of things that we actually looked at, because we did look at Ralph Meyer's paper where he tries to present the 7 kings as the names of 7 popes, not actually 7 individual popes, which is quite a different view than a lot of people have when they try to label them popes from the Lateran Treaty time to our time. So it says, it is these 7 kings that we want to deal with in this paper. Basically, there are 3 different interpretations that could be considered about who these 7 kings are. 7 individual kings, and this interpretation has a couple of variations. Some try to identify 7 individual emperors, a typical preterist view, and other 7 individual popes. So remember, when we were looking at Odilio wasn't really making this argument from Revelation 17, but he was taking that Nero was this parallel with Trump, that it had to do with July 18th, because Nero is going to burn Rome on July 18th in is it 54 AD? Yeah, I think it was, or 64. I can't remember. 64, I think. I think he starts his reign in 54. So in 64 AD, if I'm wrong, somebody can correct me. So we see the preterist view. They're going to try to label them as emperors, and that's what we were trying to look at, is if we were going to label them as emperors last week, how would we do that? And then there's others that they labeled them as individual popes. So I've told the story where we had a pastor who did all-day sermon Sabbath trying to convince us that the seven heads were seven popes, counting from 1929. Now, the most common one we see is seven kingdoms. That's the position that this movement has. We have the view it's Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, Rome pagan, Rome papal. And then there's other people who have different lists, right? And then we would have, of course, the United States being the sixth, and then the seventh is going to be the UN. Then another view, and this is the pioneer view, that it's seven forms of Roman government. And this interpretation typically identifies the first five kings as five of the following forms of government: kings, consuls, dictators, decemvirats, military tribunes, consular power, and which is military tribunes with consular power, and the triumvirate. So this, to me, when I first heard this view, it just didn't really click with me at all what was being talked about. I didn't quite understand the position. But actually looking back in history, and I made the statement that, they just sort of seemed like cherry picking, that there was different forms of government. But actually, it seems to be pretty solid, because Rome started with the kings. It was kings, and then they moved through these different forms of government. Now, dictators are something that we always think of it as a bad thing, like a permanent dictator. But they would do this in times of war, is they would declare somebody as a dictator for a short period of time. And this was to cut through a lot of the bureaucracy so that they could deal with whatever this crisis was. So it wasn't really seen as something in a negative sense. It was something that was always temporary until we got to Julius Caesar, and then we ended up with the emperors. So we can see the triumvirate is the fifth one. So one of the most important questions that needs to be answered is, when is it true that five kings have fallen? Now, this is another issue that comes in the context of how we understand prophecy. That is, when a prophet is speaking, and he's speaking about something in the past, or something in the present, or something in the future, the question is, what time is that prophet in? And that prophet isn't always in the time in which he's writing. So we know that that's the case. And he can be transported to a different time. An example of this, what time is Daniel in Daniel chapter 8? Anybody know? When does he write the chapter in Daniel chapter 8?
I think he's in Persia.
Okay, he's actually in the time of the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, which is 19 years prior to the decree of Cyrus. So he's not in the time of Persia personally when he wrote it, but in vision, he is in Persia, correct?
Yeah, that's what I was referring to.
Okay, he's going to be brought into the future to Shushan in the palace. Now, Daniel, of course, when I say he wrote it, when he received the vision was in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar. But he put together the book of Daniel near the end of his life, so he collected these visions. He would never have been in Shushan, the palace, at the time he was the king, that he was serving King Belshazzar. He was in Babylon. He wasn't in Persia. It's quite a far way away. And actually, the evidence is that the Shushan in the palace didn't even exist until much later, so that there wouldn't be, at that time, this palace in Shushan. So he's being brought into the future, which he can only recognize later when Persia conquers Babylon. So he's brought into the future. So he's going to write from the position of being in the kingdom of Persia. And that's why the 2300 days starts at the time of Persia, not because he's in the time of Persia. It doesn't start with Babylon, it starts with the Persian ram with two horns. And that's because he's being brought basically and possibly to the beginning of the 2300 days. He's probably being brought to 457 BC. So he's not writing from the time where he is, he's writing in vision from a time in the future. So that this would be a good example of this. So he's going to talk about this. So he says Revelation 17 is much like Daniel 11. While most of the prophecies of these books are dreams and visions of pictorial scenes, these two chapters are largely conversations between an angel and the prophet. We do have another example on a smaller scale of this kind of thing in Revelation 11. I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,203 days, clothed in sackcloth. And when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them and shall overcome them and kill them. He says, notice the future tenses. The one speaking to John places both the preaching and the slaying of the two witnesses into the future. Thus, the time context of the conversation with John is prior to those events. And yet, and after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life of God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them, which saw them. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, Come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. So he's going to note here that these are past tenses. Now, you have to be careful when you deal with tenses in the Old Testament. That is, Hebrew doesn't have the type of tenses we have. We have all different kinds of tenses. We have future perfect and past perfect and present perfect and all different kinds of ways. And Greek has lots of different tenses. But John, when he wrote the book of Revelation, he's writing in Greek, but he's thinking in Hebrew. That is, you can clearly see he doesn't have, like with his gospel, some Greek writer there to put it all into proper grammar. That he's writing with Hebrew grammar and putting it into Greek language. And so in Hebrew, you don't have these different tenses. All you have is a completed tense and a past tense, which, or the completed tense, which is like a past tense, and then an incomplete tense, which is like a future tense. But they don't use it always that way. So God will talk about something, or a prophet will talk about something as having been done, just as a way of saying that it's certain that it will occur, even though it's something in the future. So even though he makes this argument about future tenses, and I don't want to get bogged down on this, you have to be quite careful in understanding future tenses and completed tenses, because that's how John would think of it. So he could say that something happened in the past. Doesn't mean that he's in the future. It just means it's something that's certainly going to happen in this way. But, so I'm just saying that you can make too much about the tenses. And there's lots of examples where the tenses don't really make sense, except if you understand the Hebrew way of understanding tenses. So he says, notice the past tenses. Now, John is describing what he actually saw in the vision, not a conversation with some heavenly being. He describes scenes he saw of the future as if they were already past. So this is the thing that's going to, in his mind, in Bob Pickle's mind here, that it's going to put us into, that the prophet is in the future because he's seen something in vision. He's not being told something, right? He's seen something himself. And so in a sense, he's in that time when he's seeing this. And I think this is a valid point, though, that when John or a prophet sees something in vision as it's happening, he's in that time. He's speaking from that time. He's not going to be speaking from his time. He's going to be speaking from the time in which he's noting that vision. And we see this in the spirit of prophecy as well. So it's just kind of natural. But it's an important point because it's one of the problems that we run into when it comes to interpreting the five that are fallen. So he's going to have this point of what he's going to say. And whether he's correct or not is not really the issue. We need to understand his point because it is the pioneer's view. When John describes scenes of the future that he saw, he describes them as being past. When John records a conversation explaining future events, he describes those events as if they are yet future. We may safely conclude that the time context of such a conversation is John's day. Thus, when the angel speaks to John in Revelation 17 about the five kings being already fallen, he is speaking of them already being fallen in John's day, not at the end of time. So this would be one of the major issues that we would have with this view. But we're going to see that it's the pioneer's view. And we would have to have an answer to this. And I believe that we do have an answer to it. But we're going to see that it's not the answer necessarily that we've always given. Okay, so, and people can see this as an important point, I hope. Anybody who's dealt with Revelation 17 would know that we would need to know when he says five are fallen, we would have to know where John is when that statement is made. Says we could have looked at other passages in Revelation to arrive at the same conclusion, but it may be significant that we used Revelation 11. For it is only in Revelation 11 and in Revelation 17 that we find an explicit statement about a beast arising out of a bottomless pit. So, and these are some interesting points that he has. And so I don't want to just pass by them quickly. I want to make sure that people understand them. So if there's something you're not understanding, please comment, or if there's something that you see that he misses or I'm missing, please comment on that. So he's going to look at Revelation 11, and he's going to see there's this connection between Revelation 11 and Revelation 17, and that they talk about a beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit. So in Revelation 11:7, when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them and shall overcome them and kill them. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit. So here we see a beast ascending out of the bottomless pit. This word, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit, ascendeth is in the Greek here. It's sort of an active. So it's not a past tense or a future tense. He's just the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit. It's kind of like a present tense. But shall ascend out of the bottomless pit is definitely future tense in Revelation 17. Okay, one last thought on this matter. The 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. So he talks about this 10 horns and these 10 kings, and then we're going to have to try to understand that as well. And the time frame. And remember, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit in Revelation 11 is what power? What's the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit in Revelation 11?
Islam.
In Revelation 11? You're thinking of Revelation 9.
Right. Sorry.
Okay. And it's not a beast that ascends out.
France.
This is France, right? So France is going to ascend out of the bottomless pit. And so we would have to look at the tense here, because here he says, when they shall have finished their testimony, it's putting it as something future, or at least I'm saying it's present tense, and we're going to have to look at this ascendeth to try to see what that is, because he's sort of taking it as a future tense, but it's more a present tense, and that's an issue. Okay. Now, one last thought on this matter. He talks about these 10 horns, and we know that these horns and these beasts, that there's this time frame in which we see them. So one of the things that we understood in this movement is that there is 10 toes, there's 10 horns, and each of these beasts have 10 horns. But are they the same horns in our understanding of these beasts, or are they different? That is, are all of the horns representative, just as the toes are, of divided Rome prior to, at the end of the period when we're going to have the transition from pagan to papal Rome? Do we always take the horns as being those 10 kingdoms? So do people
should they be taken?
Well, remember, we take the 10 horns as being United Nations, and we know that 3 of the horns had already been rooted up prior to the rise of the papacy. So there was this discussion too about the toes. Well, are the toes the 10 kingdoms? Are those the same kingdoms? Are those the United Nations? So maybe it's not clear to everyone, but I think my understanding is that we took a position that the toes and the horns, even though there's 10 refers to universal, but it doesn't mean that it's always the same 10, that it can be different 10s, depending on when you're looking at this, when the prophecy is applying. So this is a position this movement has taken. So he's going to try to argue that the 10 horns are the 10 kings, and they're the same kings and the same horns, because that's how the Millerites understood it. Okay. John saw the scenes of a beast and horns as if they already existed, right? So he's in vision, he's going to see these beasts and horns as if they existed. After this, he is told that the beast doesn't yet exist again, and that the horns have no kingdom yet. So he saw them as if they already existed, but he is told they don't exist yet. This would be true if the time context of the angel's conversation was in John's day. So again, he's going to argue that the context of the conversations are in John's day, not in some future time. But when he's in vision, he's going to see things in this future time. So that's the argument he's making. So hopefully that's clear. So he's going to do some ruling out some possibilities. So this gets a little bit off track, but at least we can kind of look at it. So he says, if 5 kings are already fallen in John's day, we can narrow down the possibilities for the identification of the 7 kings. The idea that they are 7 popes is out, as well as the idea they are 7 kingdoms, beginning with Babylon. If they are indeed 7 kingdoms, the sequence would have to start with Egypt. For if we start the sequence with Babylon, only the 3 kingdoms of Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece would be fallen in John's day. So we looked at this last week. So if you're going to have them to be in John's day 7 kingdoms, and this was the argument that I was making. That's how we got in this mess, actually. And I'm just going to go there. So I'm going to show you how we got to where we are. So let me go to the Bible here. So if we go to Revelation chapter 12, we're going to see that there's this beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns, and it's going to have crowns upon its heads. There's going to be 7 heads with 7 crowns. Revelation 13, we're going to see 7 heads and 10 horns, but there's going to be 10 crowns upon the 10 horns. So they can't be the same. So this is a problem that he's going to have to address, which I don't think he really addresses as well as I would like. But we know that this is pagan Rome in the time of Christ. And if this is pagan Rome and Revelation 13 is papal Rome, we would know that we're at a different time. And if the heads are the same, you couldn't say in Revelation 12 that 5 are fallen. So that's something that has to be quite clear. You couldn't say that the beast of Revelation 12 has 5 heads that are fallen if they're kingdoms, unless you made the kingdoms Egypt, Assyria, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, Media, Persia, Greece, Rome pagan. And Rome pagan would be the one that is, and Rome papal would be the one that's yet to come. So in trying to understand Revelation 12 as being pagan Rome, we looked at that possibility. So you couldn't have it be Babylon. So if we believe that the heads are the same, you couldn't say in Revelation 12, at the time when Christ is born, that 5 are fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come, unless you had them as different nations. So the question was, could we say that the beast of Revelation 12, even though it looks similar, is actually different, that the heads are different than the beast of Revelation 13 or the beast of Revelation 17? And that, of course, creates other problems. And when we looked at this, we looked at the view of the pioneers. And the view of the pioneers is that the 7 heads are going to be 7 forms of Roman government. So we will look at that. Any questions on this so far? Because I might be moving too fast for people, because I spend a lot of time on this. So okay, so we'll go back to the paper. So if you're going to have them as 7 individual emperors, and this is sort of the view that Odilio had, though Odilio wasn't using the beast itself, he was using our understanding of the emperors and the presidents and the kings. So he's taking Daniel 11, verse 1 to 3, and he was also taking our understanding of that. And then he was comparing it to this history of the emperors. And he's going to start with Julius Caesar. So he's going to take that these are the 7: Caesar, Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, and Galba. And so he's going to place Nero as parallel to Trump. So, and we're gonna have to come back and look at this again. Now, there are other lists that people have, and these are usually preterists, right? So you're gonna have Claudius, Nero, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, and Titus. Now, Vespasian is the one who's the emperor during the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and Titus is the general. But Vespasian is the one who's ruling then. So he's going to rule till 79, and then Titus begins to rule. So these lists are based upon people's interpretation of what's happening, and what the context is in which John is writing. So he says the problem with the last 2 lists is there doesn't seem to be any logical reason to exclude the emperors prior to Claudius and Galba. Why not include Augustus, Tiberius, and Caligula? So one of the things we looked at is who is the emperor at the time of the end in the time of Christ? Because where do we mark the time of the end if we're going to take the reform line in the time of Christ?
Titus was the last one, wasn't it?
Okay, but in the time of Christ, when Christ is born, we have the time of the end. right? Because we have the line of Christ. We're going to have the time of the end. We're going to have a period of darkness. The people that walked in darkness saw a great light. That's going to be Christ. So when do we mark the time of the end in Christ's line? Anybody remember? Because we have the time of the end in our time, 1989. We have in Millerite history, 1798. So where's the time of the end in the time of Christ?
Tiberius Caesar? No? Okay.
Well, we would have,
The-
okay, what the event that we mark is the birth of Christ marks the time of the end, correct? Because you're going to
Right.
have John the Baptist coming. He's also there as well. So some people
Well,
mark John the Baptist.
that would be Julius then, wouldn't it?
That'd be Augustus.
Or Augustus?
Yeah. In the time of Caesar Augustus, there went out a decree that all the world should be taxed. Caesar has died long before that, in like 45 or whatever.
Okay.
So you BC. So you got Augustus. So Augustus Caesar is, so if we were going to count 7, we would start with Augustus, right? He's going to be the first. You wouldn't count Julius Caesar. He's not there. So you would have Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, and then you would have to say, well, the 7th is going to be Otho. But that wouldn't really make sense. I mean, none of that would fit. 5 are fallen, 1 is, 1's yet to come. So we proposed an idea where we took Galba, Otho, and Vitellius and ignored them, and we just took the ones that were relevant to the time of Christ. So we're going to have Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, and then you're going to have Vespasian, and then the one that's going to come would be Titus. Even though Titus destroys Jerusalem in the time of Vespasian, he's going to be counted as the 7 heads. So that was just one way of looking at it, trying to understand Odilio's paralleling that to the time of the end in our time. So trying to parallel the Caesars with the kings or the presidents of the United States. And we know that Caesar is not actually an emperor, right? He's a dictator. And imperial Rome begins with Augustus. So that's when they create the emperors. Plus the time of the end isn't in the time of Caesar. So so the first list necessitates that John be exiled in Patmos during the reign of Nero, which seems unlikely. We know that during the reign of Nero, that's going to end in, I'm just trying to remember. I think it's going to be, because Nero's reign is going to end in, and then after Nero, you're going to have Galba, so it's going to be like 60. Anybody remember the years? I'm always getting these mixed up. But anyway, you're going to have the year of the four emperors. So when Nero dies, you're going to have Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then finally Vespasian. All of those are going to be emperors in the year 69 AD. So I think it's in 68 when Nero dies. And Julius Caesar was never really an emperor. And what would be the point of ending with Galba? What would be the point of the prophecy? So he asked some good questions if you're going to try to make these emperors to be the 7 heads. And then he's going to address the 10 kings. So Daniel 7:24 also speaks of 10 horns representing 10 kings, which parallel Daniel 2's 10 toes. So we got the 10 toes and the 10 horns. And would we agree that the 10 kings or the 10 horns that represent 10 kings and the 10 toes are the same in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, that they were referred to the same kingdoms or the same?
Yeah, I would think so. It's repeat and enlargement, I would think so.
Okay. So we would take that position. That's pretty much a standard Adventist position. I know that Parminder was trying to create doubt or confusion, at least, regarding that. There was a lot of talk about the clay. I don't know if you remember all that. Um, hopefully you've forgotten most of it. Okay, anyway, in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So we have our understanding of this is that we have these 10 toes. These are the same as the 10 horns, and that it's in the time of these 10 toes or 10 kings that Christ sets up his kingdom. These 10 kings rise out of the fourth kingdom in both Daniel 2 and 7. The four kingdoms are Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome. When Rome broke up in the 5th century, 10 nations arose in Western Europe, most of which still exist today. What Daniel 2:44 is telling us is that these kingdoms will still be around when Jesus returns at his second coming. Clearly, the 10 kings of Daniel 2 and 7 are still around at the end of time. If the 10 horns of Revelation 17 are also 10 kings at the end of time, they must be the same 10 kings as those in Daniel 2 and 7. Otherwise, we would have 20 kings, 2 sets of 10 at the end of time. Now, anybody have some answer to what he says in these 2 sentences, the last paragraph there? What would be the problem with this reasoning? So he's saying, if they're the same 10 toes and they exist to the end of time, if we have another set of 10, that means there's actually 20. So they'd have to be the same set of 10. What would be the problem with this argument that he's making?
For me, yeah, it would kind of conflict. So the Bible say, well, the 10, kings, they're not given a kingdom as yet.
Yeah.
You know, so some of the criteria, in my opinion, wouldn't fit, but I'll just leave it there.
Okay, well, he's going to answer that one by basically saying that when it talks about that's the conversation one, and so that's something that still hasn't happened in John's day, that he's talking in a conversation. And when he's a conversation, he's going to be talking from the 1st century AD. So those 10 kingdoms wouldn't have had a kingdom as yet. But I would think the problem here is that don't we understand 10 to be a symbol? That do we believe that there was actually 10 nations that survived? Because weren't 3 of those horns plucked up?
Correct.
So
And
even though
10
there's
is just a symbol for completion or complete.
and we see it, dealing with the 10 different nations at different times that are symbolically representing the Gentile world. So 10 here can't be taken literally, because when we talk about the United Nations, we don't need to take the number 10 literally. We would see the number 10 as representing universality as far as the world is concerned.
But United Nations has the world divided into 10 different regions, right?
No, not that I could find. I've heard that. I haven't been able to find it. The papacy does, but I haven't found that the United Nations does. And you can find that in the book Keys of This Blood by Malachi Martin. He talks about the 10 divisions that the papacy uses. And I think people just kind of conflated the two. They just assume that the United Nations divides the world into 10 because the papacy does.
Well, maybe that's what I'm doing, but
Yeah, but
because
I've heard it.
I seen the map, but I just
Yeah, there is a map, but the papacy's map. That's the one I've seen.
okay.
So, but yeah, I've heard people say it's the United Nations. I haven't found that that's the case, but I could be wrong. Maybe I just haven't found it. Okay, but anyway, we know that the number 10 doesn't have to be taken literally. Because even if you talked about the world being divided into 10 things by the United Nations, nobody knows about that, right? It's just that these are the United Nations. They're universal. in that sense. So understanding things as a symbol, that would be the argument I would have against that. So I would say that the 10 toes represent that universality at a certain time, during the time in which Rome goes from pagan to papal. But the 10 horns in Revelation 17 would represent that universal kingdom that now is the whole world. It's not just relegated to Europe. And this idea that it's relegated to Europe is something we'll see in evangelistic series all the time, right? We'll see that the 10 toes of Europe, and we'll look at, they'll never be able to cleave one to another. So, when they had the European Union, there was lots being made about that, these types of ideas. And that's because we would say that the 10 toes or the 10 kingdoms are Europe. But we can see that in our understanding of that, that's universal. That's the United Nations, not just Europe itself. And the other thing about it is we know that where is the United Nations located?
America.
USA.
In the USA. So to us, that becomes an important part of understanding the prophecy. Okay. So now he's going to address the 7 kings themselves. Now, this part, he's going to talk about the 7 mountains as 7 hills. Now, you'll see people arguing that they're not really mountains, that Rome's 7 hills aren't mountains. Now, what's the difference between a mountain and a hill?
Mountains can represent the church, or kingdom of God.
No, but I just mean in a literal sense. Like if you're going to say that something's a mountain or something's a hill, what's the difference? How do you decide if something's a mountain or something's a hill?
The height.
Mountain's quite a bit bigger. So.
Okay, how much bigger? How big does something have to be a mountain and not a hill?
Well, we're talking about, a couple miles of difference. So.
But it's not something that's easy definable, because sometimes we'll talk about, if you look in Jerusalem and they talk about mountains, some of the things that they call mountains coming,
Mount Olives is not that big.
I would say that they're hills, right? I wouldn't even call them mountains. I mean, what about Mount Zion? Is Mount Zion a mountain or a hill?
A hill.
It's a hill.
No.
Right? It's a
So
hill.
yeah.
But the Bible calls it a mountain. And there's not really much difference between.
And prior to the flood, they call them mountains there too, but the mountains were not like we see the mountains today. So
Right.
for sure. So.
Yeah. The mountains today are much bigger than the mountains in the time of the flood.
They'd be talking symbolically here.
Yeah, well, but even symbolically, we need to at least understand literally. People will say, well, the 7 hills of Rome aren't mountains, so they can't be the 7 heads that are being talked about. But all I'm just saying is that when it comes to defining what a hill and a mountain is, in the Bible, they talk about things as mountains that we would call hills. Right? So there isn't a difference between a mountain and a hill. It's just another word that really describes the same thing. It's not something that's distinct. You can't, even though we might do that in English, we might say, well, that's a hill, that's a mountain, but we're not always in agreement even on that. So it's going to talk about the 7 hills of Rome: the Aventine, the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Caelian, the Quirinial, the Viminal, and the Esquiline. And to these we can add an 8th. More on that later. There are supposed to have been 7 kings reigning in Rome before the Roman Republic was founded around 509 BC. Romulus, Numa, Pompilius, all these different guys' names, doesn't really matter. It's a bunch of Latin. To this list, we can add an 8th. Titus Tatius ruled jointly with Romulus after the Sabines, of whom he was a king, united with the Romans. The history or legend of Rome's founding tells us about the kings in the hills. Romulus first built in the Palatine, and then the Capitoline, right, and so forth. Now this I thought was sort of, this isn't really talking about any of the things that we've been studying, but he's just trying to address this problem that other people have looked at. He says, while Emperor Aurelian, during his reign from 270 to 275 AD, extended Rome's walls further than these hills, the old wall of Servius included just these 7, most of the Calian and Esquiline, and all of the other 5, within Roman limits. This wall of Servius was named after the 6th king, who had supposedly extended the walls that far, but modern authorities feel it was built after the Gauls destroyed Rome in 390 BC. Regardless of which is true, in John's day, there were just 7 hills enclosed by the walls of Rome. Now, he brings up this point and you'll see why. Okay, since all of the 7 original kings of Rome were kings of Rome, and since all the 7 hills of Rome were within the walls of Rome, it would make sense for the 7 kings of Revelation 17 to also all be in some way a part of Rome. This suggests that we should consider the idea that the 7 kings of Revelation 17 are 7 forms of government within Rome. So this is the pioneer view. Now, he's going to jump over here to the crowns, and I don't quite agree with him on these crowns and the heads, but let's take a look at this. There appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. The crowns are upon the heads. Why? While the dragon is primarily Satan, it is also secondarily pagan Rome. We know this from the spirit of prophecy. Since it was through pagan Rome that Satan persecuted the church after Christ's ascension. Revelation 12:5, 6, 12, 13. Since pagan Rome had a strong central government, having crowns upon the 7 heads of the dragon makes sense. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. So you're going to see now in Revelation 13, the beast that rises up out of the sea is not the same beast that we see in Revelation 12. That is, on the 1843 chart, we're going to see that the beast of Revelation 12 is called pagan Rome, and the beast of Revelation 13 is called papal Rome.
And he's got written on his heads the name blasphemy.
Right, so that we can see that yeah. So that's going to address, and this, there's some really interesting details that we're going to look at when it comes to this as we get into Revelation 13 deeper. And I was going to start to do that today, though I wasn't really planning to read this paper. And getting ready for the study, I realized I probably need to read this so that people know where I'm coming from and what I'm trying to do. So we're going to see that this beast here is obviously papal Rome, not pagan Rome. There's no crowns upon the heads. Instead, they are upon the horns. Why? Papal Rome was not the strong central government that pagan Rome had been. Papal Rome consisted of independent sovereign nations held together by a common religion headed by the Pope. Crowns upon the horns instead of upon the heads symbolize this fact. It was the horns that were sovereign, not the beast itself. So if we're going to look at what he's talking about here, I'm just going to go to Revelation 13. Now, we did the study on Revelation 12. So remember, in Revelation 12, it's going to start with the birth of Christ, with the great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and that this is going to lead to the time of the papacy. It's going to persecute them, and they're going to flee into the wilderness for 1260 years. And so we have to take the position that when we get to Revelation 13, we aren't in John's day. Now, he is in vision, that is, it isn't a conversation. I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise out of the sea, right? I saw. So he's in vision. I saw one of the heads, as it were, wounded to death. So we know that the head that's wounded to death couldn't be in John's day, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. So this is going to relate to how we understand Revelation 17, because the position that we've always taken is the head that receives the deadly wound is the one in Revelation 17 that is not, right? So there's going to be the one that is, that's not going to be the one that receives, it's going to be dead, so to speak. So he's though going to look at this quite differently, right? So he's going to look at the head that's wounded to death as not being the papacy. Or it could be the papacy, but not in the way that we see it. That is, it wouldn't be the fifth head. Because the seventh head, in his understanding, as you'll see, is the papal head. And so he would have to be the one that receives the deadly wound, would have to be the papal head. That would be the seventh head, not the fifth. So that is, when it talks about five are fallen and one is, he's not equating the fallen with the heads that's wounded, right? You understand what I'm saying? So we take the position that the head that's wounded is the fifth because five are fallen. But he takes the position that the head that's wounded is the papacy at the end because it's the seventh kingdom. So I know it's a little bit hard to get, it was hard to get my mind around to how he saw this. This is the pioneer view. So we're going to have these.
Hello, guys.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, guys. And I start to texting you. You call me.
Okay.
You
Well,
have my other text I just sent you. I let you help me.
I didn't
What
get it.
I have feeling.
Okay, I see that. Yeah, that was a while ago, I guess, eh? Okay, thanks, Mark. Anyway,
Yes,
so just enjoy the study.
sir.
Okay, so we see that there's this difference between the pioneer view and our view, and we're going to have to try to reconcile that. And we're going to see that the deadly wound will be healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. So, if it's the seventh head that's wounded and that's healed, that's much different than to say it's the fifth head. Okay, Jeff, did you have a comment?
I was just saying what you said. Much different, yes.
Yeah, that just kind of sounded distorted. I couldn't tell what you said. Okay, so we're still going to look at this view, but you can see the problem here, that there's definitely a difference. But we can see that this is all in vision. So it's not a conversation like you see in Revelation 17. And that's where he's making this difference. And he's going to deal with the beast that comes out of the earth. Now, again, he's going to be in vision, seeing a beast coming up out of the earth. Again, that's a present tense. So that means in vision, he's going to be in 1798. But he's arguing that he can't be in 1798 or in some future time in Revelation 17 because he's having a conversation. That's going to be his argument. So we have to try to address that. Okay, so let's go back to his paper. So he says a similar picture is found in Daniel 2. Clay holds together iron fragments somewhat in the feet and toes. Likewise, the beast holds together somewhat the 10 horns with their crowns. During the Middle Ages, what unity there was between the nations of Europe was only somewhat. It was the papacy that provided a unifying force, but whatever unity was achieved was never complete. Constantly there was political intrigue, political differences, and outright war. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast of Revelation 17 has no crowns at all, suggesting that the form of government being represented by this beast is one that has no king. Indeed, this thought is not new. The beast that was denotes the Roman Republic that was 1900 years ago, and is not, that is, not when John was having his vision in 96 AD, because imperial Rome was then the form of government, and continued to be until 538, when the 7th form of government, that is the papacy, even he is the 8th. The 8th undoubtedly is, as we have shown, the 2-horned beast with its image, a symbol of the people of Republican America, as they are and will be and is of the 7. The 8th will cause all under his influence to worship the one that is called the 7th. So this is Joseph Bates writing in 1851. This is in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. So August 5th, 1851. So what is Joseph Bates saying? Maybe everybody can't pick up on it because it's kind of unfamiliar with this. We're not familiar with this view. So when he says that he is the 8th, and the 8th is of the 7, he says that that the papal Rome is the 7th form. So what is he saying? Can anybody kind of put this on people to think?
Well, it looks like he's saying that, yeah, he's the 7th, the papal form,
Mhm.
and he loses the he's wounded to death, but only because of the state the state
Okay,
to separate. So
yeah.
and then he gains his power and he becomes the 8th, but he's off the 7th. So
Yeah, so what he's arguing is the 8th is the United States. That's the 2-horned beast. And it's
okay.
one of the forms of government. That is, it's the Republican form of Roman government that the United States displays. So the 7th head of Rome itself is papal Rome. So when it receives a deadly wound, that's the end of papal Rome. And the beast that's going to arise from the earth is the United States. It's the 8th. That's what Joseph Bates is saying. And it's of the 7 because it's a form of government that is one of the forms of government of Rome, particularly republicanism. So Bob Pickle says, the present author would differ a little with the above, but the point is that Bates identifies the beast of Revelation 17, the one without crowns, as being a republic, a revival of the republicanism of old Rome, a republicanism that was dead at the time John wrote the book of Revelation. This coincides with the idea that the absence of crowns indicates a government that has no king. So I'd read this before in Miller's writings, and I didn't really understand the point because I didn't fully understand the argument. And so we're going to have to address this. How do we address the difference that we have from the pioneers' understanding of this? Now, here we have a search for a common tie. So this is an interesting point that he brings out. So 4 passages are linguistically tied together in Revelation, while their typical interpretations have been totally unrelated. So we're going to see Revelation 9. We're going to have and Revelation 11 and Revelation 17 and Revelation 13. So we're going to see what he's pointing to here. They had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon. So we know that that's referring to Islam. And when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them and shall overcome them and kill them. So the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit, we can see the bottomless pit is that thing that ties it together. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, Revelation 17, verse 8. And I beheld another beast coming out of the earth, had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon, Revelation 13, 11. Typically, historicists have identified the beast from the bottomless pit in chapter 11 as being France during its revolution, while the beast of the bottomless pit of chapter 17 has been identified as a revived papacy. The king, the angel of the bottomless pit of chapter 9, has been identified in some way with Islam. And then the beast of Revelation 13 has no crowns on either his head or his horns. Just like the beast of Revelation 17 has been identified with the United States. For very different interpretations, is there nothing that ties these symbols together? There indeed is something, and that something is republicanism. An atheistic brand of republican or democracy wreaked havoc during the French Revolution. A Protestant brand of republicanism gave birth to the freedoms found in the United States. And the Muslims? In Mecca, despotism was impossible. The fierce, free-born Arabs of the desert would tolerate no master, and their innate democracy had been sanctioned by the Prophet, who had explicitly declared that all believers were brothers. The Meccan Caliphate was a theocratic democracy. Abu Bakr and Omar were elected by the people and held themselves responsible to public opinion. So that's from The New World of Islam by Lothrop Stoddard. Anyway, so when we read, and the beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth, and is of the seven, and goeth into perdition, we are reading about a confederacy of republics, a revival of the republican form of government of old Rome. Republicanism and democracy is the only conceivable tie between the four passages. So it's a very, very odd understanding. It's something I still have to try to get my mind around, that you're going to put the United States in with Islam, with the papacy, and in its different forms, right? And France. So you got Islam, France, papacy, United States, all having this characteristic we call republicanism, which we would look at as a good thing. So it says, so when we read the beast that was, is not, even he is the eighth, and is of the seven, and goeth into perdition, we are reading about a confederacy of republics. So we're going to see that, I'm not sure if this completely makes sense, if I buy into his argument here, but it's something to think about. And that wouldn't be the pioneer view. They never tied those together. He has. Okay, this beast, that beast, which beast? Okay, Revelation talks about the dragon and several beasts. How do we keep from confusing one beast with another? Revelation 13 gives us a clue. The first beast of Revelation 13, 1-10 seems to be consistently called throughout the book the beast. The second beast of 13:11 is identified as another beast. And then is never called a beast again. Instead, to prevent confusion, he is called the false prophet. In Revelation 16:13, 9:20, 19:20, and 2010, in all three of these passages, he appears alongside the beast. Both are pictured together. One is called the beast, and the other is called the false prophet. What this suggests is that whenever we read about the beast, we must be reading about the first beast of Revelation 13. If John sees things that he has already seen before, he prefaces his words with the. If he has seen something new, he omits the. That would be a Hebrew way of doing it. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, Revelation 17:3. Apparently, John is indicating that he has seen something new, something different than the beast he saw in Revelation 16:13. We would then expect that in every place afterwards where the first beast of Revelation 13 is intended, he will be identified as the beast. In every place where the beast of Revelation 17 is intended, some sort of qualifier will be added to enable us to distinguish him from the first beast of Revelation 13. So this point is going to be something we have to examine as we continue to move through this study, because we're not really studying Revelation 17 yet. I'm mostly trying just to look at Revelation 13. That to me is the main focus of this study. Even though he's talking about Revelation 17, to me it's understanding Revelation 13, the heads there, and Revelation 12 as well. What makes this more apparent is the fact that Revelation 16:13 pictures the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, all involved in getting people to the Battle of Armageddon. Then we have the scarlet beast of Revelation 17. Then we have an actual picture of the Battle of Armageddon in Revelation 19, verse 19 and onward, in which the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet are clearly seen. Clearly, the beast of 16:13 must be the same as the beast of 19:20, inasmuch as the scarlet beast of chapter 17 is a beast instead of the beast. He must be totally different beasts set apart by some sort of qualifiers whenever he is mentioned. So we already understand, at least we've taken the position, that these beasts can't be the same thing. We know that the beast of Revelation 12 can't be the beast of Revelation 13, where he's trying to argue that that the beast of Revelation 13 is the beast when it talks about the beast. The great red dragon isn't really the beast, it is a beast. The beast of Revelation 13 is the beast. And then the beast of Revelation 17 would be different. Now, we already know that there are some differences. They look different. They appear to be operating in a different time, at least from our understanding of things. But we also know that they have different characteristics regarding the crowns and the heads. We know the beast of Revelation 13 is a composite beast that has characteristics of Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome in its symbolism. It has can't remember all the different parts, but feet as a bear. Can't remember what it has as a leopard. I think the skin of a leopard and the mouth of a lion, right? I think that's how it goes. So he's saying that we need to be clear in Revelation 17 when it's talking about the beast that was and is not, and yet is. It's not talking about the beast upon which the woman is sitting. Okay. And anybody have any questions at this point? Okay, hopefully.
You sent out this article you emailed it to everyone, or?
Yeah, I emailed it. Yeah. And I know it's going to take a bit of time to digest it. I mean, I've read it 3 times. This is the 4th time.
When did you email it? Because I don't recall.
I emailed it like a couple hours ago.
Oh.
Oh,
Okay.
recently. Okay.
Yeah. I did.
That's why I haven't seen it. So.
Yeah, because originally I wasn't going to read this article, but once I was getting ready for the study today, then I realized I needed to read it, so I better send it out to people. But we're going to come back to it. So even right now, I'm introducing these ideas. We're definitely going to have to come back to it and address it, and sort of tear apart his argument in certain places. There's some points though that I think that we need to see. One is I do believe that the pioneers were correct, at least in part. And especially we're going to deal with the beast in Revelation chapter 12. We would have to take their position as pretty solid. The question is, how do we understand? How can we take our view, and how can it line up with the pioneer view? And we know in the article that Uriah Smith had written, he basically would dismiss our view as not correct, because he takes the pioneer view, as Bob Pickle does. Okay, so he's going to do a verse-by-verse analysis. The angel said unto me, wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman, of the beast that carrieth her, which hath 7 heads and 10 horns. Which beast? Clearly the qualifier identifies this beast as the one John just saw, the scarlet beast. The beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition, and they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. Revelation 17:8. Which beast? The scarlet beast. Republican was the order of the day before Augustus Caesar. It was not in John's day, and it would ascend and be a dominant force in the end. So his view is very, very different, as you can see here. Interestingly, not until World War I did this even begin to come true, though it almost did during the revolutions of 1848. During the World War I, the monarchies of Turkey, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Russia all met their demise, and the world has been marching on toward a confederacy of republics and democracies ever since. Not that communist Russia fit the bill, but that's where the world has been heading ever since World War I. And here's the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come, and when he cometh, he must continue a short space. As mentioned before, the interpretation being suggested here typically identifies the first 5 kings as being 5 of the following forms of Roman government: kings, consuls, dictators, decemvirs, military tribunes with consular power, and the triumvirate. Some expositors have left out military tribunes and have left out the triumvirate, but both of these were legitimate heads of the government at one time or another. Perhaps the simplest solution to needing to choose 5 of the 6 is to start with the founding of the Republic in 509 BC. This then leaves out the monarchical form of government from the list. Would this be permissible? The records of the 7 monarchs who reigned before the Republic start with Romulus. His father is said to be the god Mars, and he was suckled as an infant by a she-wolf. Obviously, there are aspects of the story that are fictitious. For such reasons, the list of 7 kings is often called legendary. The last 3 of the 7 monarchs were Etruscans, not Romans. After the founding of the Republic in 509 BC, we have Rome being ruled by Romans. This suggests that perhaps we should start the 5 at that time. Daniel 7 said that Rome was diverse from all other beasts before it, and it was. Babylon, Persia, and Grecian Empire, founded by Alexander, did not repeatedly change their form of government like Rome did. They also were monarchies, not republics. Rome indeed was diverse, and one is. The imperial form of government was the one that existed in John's day. This would be the 6th head, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. Some have suggested that the 7th head was the exarch of Ravenna, since he didn't rule from Rome. This does not seem likely. Each of the 7 heads should be a form of government that ruled from the 7-hilled city of Rome. It therefore seems more probable that this 7th head is the medieval papacy. Yet how could this 1260-year-long reign be considered a short space? Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time. Now, the other argument I would use here is that the 1260 years is a portion of a longer time prophecy. It's a short time, not in the sense of just momentary, but it's also a period of time that is part of a longer period. So it's shortened, if that makes sense. So that's the argument I would use.
2520 or for the 2520.
Well, it's part of the 2520, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's part of the 2520 prophetic mirror. So it's even part of a bigger thing than just the 2520 itself. This is spoken probably soon after Christ's ascension. The short time the devil would then last from Christ's ascension to the end of time. If the last 2,000 years can be called a short time, surely 1,260 years can be called a short space. Now, see, and again, I'm going to take this short time here as being part of a time prophecy. That it's not just that it's a short time, but it's part of his structure. The devil knows that he has a short time because he understands the time prophecies involved. The beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth and is of the seven and goeth into perdition. Which beast? The qualifier points back to verse 8, which in turn pointed us to the scarlet beast. So the scarlet beast of Revelation 17 must be the eighth king. Interestingly, there is an eighth hill of great significance over at Rome. It sits across on the other side of the Tiber River from the original seven. It is the Vatican. Aurelian's walls never surrounded it. Until 850 AD, it sat outside of Rome. After the papacy returned from Avignon, France, in the 1370s, the Vatican Hill became the headquarters of the papacy. Thus we have a prophecy that the world in the end of time will become a conglomeration of republics and democracies under the spiritual leadership of a papacy, the grand headquarters of which will be upon the eighth hill. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but received power as kings 1 hour with the beast. So this wouldn't be a pioneer view here that he's presenting. This is something that he's developed, as far as I can see, or he's taken from someone else. But it would be consistent with the pioneer view. A popular rendering of the phrase 1 hour has been at the same time. Thus, these 10 kings, already identified with the 10 toes and horns of Daniel 2 and 7, receive their kingdom at the same time as the beast. Which beast? Since there are no qualifiers here, the beast referred to would be the first beast of chapter 13, not the scarlet beast of chapter 17. That being so, we have a picture here of the 10 nations of Western Europe coming to power at the same time as the papacy did. And that is precisely what happened during the 5th century. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. This indeed happened during the Middle Ages, but it would appear that the prophet is speaking more specifically of end-time events. Thus we have a prediction that the 10 horns, now republics and democracies, instead of monarchies, will again surrender their sovereignty in some way to the papal power. Similar wording is used in verse 17. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will and to agree and to give their kingdom unto the beast until the words of God shall be fulfilled. So what has he done here that is significant? I mean, there's lots of things here. Has he opened up the door for us to take the pioneer understanding and expand upon it by looking at a repeat of history?
That would be an interesting premise.
Okay, so when we look at our understanding, because I'm of the opinion that God has been leading this movement and that we have an understanding of Revelation 17 that I don't think we can just completely abandon just because the pioneers didn't hold this view. But I think we would have to see our understanding as an application, as a repeat of history, which we hadn't quite understood. And I haven't sorted it all out yet, but there's some things that are quite compelling, and I don't know what other people think about this, but we will have to look at this in more detail as we move through these studies. Now, and we know that we already do this, right? We do this with Daniel 11, verse 1 to 3, correct? We take a history and we repeat that history and we apply it to the United States, and we have solid grounds to do so. We're using Miller rules. We understand the end from the beginning. We can see that what happens at the end of Daniel chapter 11 is typified by the events that happen all throughout chapter 11, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So what I'm suggesting, what I'm seeing here is that if we are to understand Revelation correctly, we should see the same type of thing that we have in our understanding of Daniel chapter 11. And Collins' study agrees with that application. That is, and Odilio's study agrees with that application. And what Jeff had brought out in 2015, 2016 is agreeing with that application, and that continued to unfold. That in order to understand prophecy and its application, we need to understand the repeat of history, because the key to the future and to the present is the past. And any thoughts on that?
We have to have the application from history in order to properly place where we are on these lines.
Right. And if we're going to understand this repeat of history, because and again, I haven't sorted it all out, but the thing that we saw is that, and this is what Parminder was trying to do, is he was trying to create confusion on this issue. And what he was trying to confuse us about with the toes and the horns, all this type of confusion, to basically to undermine this message, because it was actually an undermining of this message. I understand now, looking back retrospectively, but at the time, I didn't see what he was doing. But we don't have to take the symbols of the 10 toes and the 10 horns and make their original application different. We just need to see that we can take an application of them and put it in the future, because history is repeated. That's what this movement has taught. And that when we lay out these lines, what we're doing is we're taking the past fulfillment of prophecy and we're seeing it repeated in our history. And then we can understand, if we have the correct interpretation of that prophecy and we can lay them all over top of each other, then it can give us the details for us to understand our present situation. Because we're at the end of the world. It's the effect of every vision. Would people agree with what I've said there?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I do think that we have to go back and look at Revelation 12, 13, and 17 and understand them a little bit differently. But I don't think it's going to give us a huge, it's not going to be a rejection of our message. We're going to see that it's going to give us more clarity in understanding how we have made these applications and why. And it's going to protect us from error, because we have the past to guide us in the present and in the future. So I'm just going to read this again here. So he says, which beast? Since there is no qualifiers here, the beast referred to would be the first beast of chapter 13, not the scarlet beast of chapter 17. That being so, we have a picture here of the 10 nations of Western Europe coming to power at the same time as the papacy did. And that is precisely what happened in the 5th century. These have one mind. They shall give their power and strength unto the beast. This indeed happened during the Middle Ages, but it would appear that the prophet is speaking more specifically of end time events. Thus, we have a prediction that the 10 horns, now republics and democracies instead of monarchies, will again surrender their sovereignty in some way to the papal power. Similar wording is used in verse 17. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will and to agree and to give their kingdom unto the beast until the words of God shall be fulfilled. The woman who sits upon the scarlet beast must certainly be a representation of at least the papacy. Thus, when the 10 kings give their kingdom to the beast, this is the same as saying that they are giving their kingdom to the woman. For this reason, she was pictured riding upon the scarlet-colored beast, whom she had under her control. Yet a predicted change is to come, and the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and she shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. The very ones who gave her power would be the instruments of taking it away. Thus it was in 1798. The French nation was to a large extent responsible for the papacy's initial power. The very same nation took that power away. Okay, so when we were going through an understanding of examining the foundation, we really came to understand something quite clear. Is there a Sunday law in 538?
Yes,
Yes.
Okay, and we also came to understand, and this was me and Stephen mostly worked on this, but in 538, what happened on December 25th? We usually had put this on another year, but we came to understand that something happened on December 25th in 538. What was it?
Sunday law.
Okay, it was the baptism of Clovis. So most people would put the baptism of Clovis in 496 AD. But as we've done in some studies, we've come to understand that his baptism was actually in 538. And it's a symbol of the Sunday law, correct? Because on our line is December 25th, the symbol of the Sunday law.
Yes.
Yeah, December 25th, 2021 is the symbol of the Sunday law. We had already understood that. And we have other December 25th, 25th days of the 12th month is when Jehoiachin was released from prison. And so we've looked at those December 25th. But one of the things we see that is in 538, he's pointing out this point that we had looked at many times, is France is the one that puts the papacy upon the throne of the world. Right? It gives it its throne.
Yes.
Okay. Now France is the one that, now we know that it's going to be happening as the Roman Empire falls, the power seat in great authority, but it's France that finally places the papacy there and gives it the persecutory power. France becomes the military for the papacy, but it's also going to be the one that's going to take the papacy off the throne of the world in 1798. So we have these histories that are types, and we definitely can apply them at the end of the world if we understand them correctly in the past. Okay, so it says, these shall make war with the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. We are thus given a view of the political landscape of the world at the time of the Battle of Armageddon, under the spiritual leadership of the papacy. The conglomeration of republics and democracies unite in rebellion against the mild and beneficent rule of Christ. So this is the United Nations, but seen in a different way, as a repeat of history. Okay, so I'm going to just leave this rest here for now. He's just going to quote a bunch of different people, Uriah Smith, Adam Clark, William Miller, and so forth. And then he's going to have some questions, but we're not going to look at that because I don't want to go later. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful for people. I want people to go through this study. and we're definitely going to look at Revelation 13 a little bit more next week at the rise of the United States and what Ellen White says about it and the significance of how we take this in the context of what he's saying and what Joseph Bates had said. Any questions?
No other questions, but I went through Jeff Pippinger's Habakkuk tables number 59 and 60 where he
Okay.
addresses there. I went through that again. So
Okay. Yeah, and so, you know, one of the things that we can see here is in examining the foundation and going back to the old paths, we're going to find that, you know, God has been leading this movement, but it doesn't mean our understanding is complete. But we saw this with Miller. Miller understood the 2520, the starting date. It was given to him. But did he understand Leviticus 26 correctly? He didn't have the
No.
4 7 times, right? He didn't understand how it was fulfilled with literal Israel. But he had the correct answer. It's like somebody doing math and they get the correct answer, even though they did their work wrong in some ways. And this is how God has been leading this movement. But by going back to the past, it gives us more light on our understanding as we move forward. And that's the thing that I find fascinating, is that every time that we have done this, that we've gone back to the pioneers, and we saw that there's some difference in how we understood things and the pioneers understood things, that they really weren't true differences. They were just incomplete. And by understanding their views, it helps us in understanding our view. And that's why we're doing this exercise and going through these things. So hopefully people can spend some time on their own studying these things. We still have a lot of work to do before we get to the end of this whole study, because we have to go, as I said before, we have to go through the 7 kings of Media Persia. We have to go through the last 7 kings of Judah. We have to go through the last 7 kings of Israel, the first 7 kings of Judah, the first 7 kings of Israel, the presidents. And,
7 stands.
what's that?
7 stands as 7 different churches.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Okay, so if there's no more questions or comments, we can close with prayer. Okay, let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we are so very thankful for the time that we have on the Sabbath to study together, to have fellowship. And we just ask, Lord, that we can continue to study your word and understand it correctly. We pray for each person that your angels can watch over them. We pray for the meetings on Sabbath, the studies, and for those that are traveling, that you can give them safety. And we ask, Lord, that you can speak to us individually, that we can know that you are near, we can know your presence, and that we can obey your voice, and that we can walk with you. Thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray and ask these things. Amen.